Calvin and Hobbes, you can see their picture on the front of your order of service, was a comic strip that ran from 1985 to 1995 in over 2,400 newspapers. Calvin was a precocious 6-year-old, and Hobbes was his stuffed tiger, who often was the voice of reason. The characters are named after John Calvin, one of the leaders of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century in Europe, and Thomas Hobbes, who was a philosopher in the 17th century. It's not surprising then that this simple daily comic strip had both very heavy religious and philosophical overtones. John Calvin actually intersects with Unitarian Universalism in very profound ways. First, he is well known as the man who condemned and killed Michael Servetus. Servetus was a brilliant man in the 1500s. He read the Bible in its original languages. Don't worry, I'll get to the comic strip in a minute, but I just got a little background. And he wrote a book called On the Errors of the Trinity. And for this, he was condemned by both the Catholic and the Protestant churches. There was not a lot that the two of them agreed on in the 1500s, but that they agreed on, that they could condemn him. Well, Servetus then went underground and changed his identity and became a famous doctor who discovered the blood circulatory system, actually. But for some inexplicable reason, 23 years later, after going into hiding, he went to a church service in Geneva, Switzerland, where Calvin was, and he was then captured and subsequently burnt at the stake by Calvin, the first Unitarian martyr. Yet his actions still resound in our religion. Our striving to learn new things, not accepting dogma as truth, and the willingness to speak truth to power even at a personal loss to ourselves. In addition to Servetus, I would say Unitarianism and Universalism was created in part as a response to Calvinist theology, that theology of predestination and original sin. We respond to theologies that we don't agree with. We respond to the call of justice. We respond to the needs of the world. And we respond to the call from the deep well of our souls. But it's not just a matter of what we respond to. It's also how we respond. And we respond with caring. We respond with creativity. And we respond with love. And so it was that I responded to this comic strip. Because even this comic strip asks us to ponder many of the deep questions of life. The final strip was run in December of 1995, and it still lives on in my heart almost 20 years later. It spoke to me in such a deep way that I actually cut the strip out of the paper, and I have kept it in my office all these years. There it is. Yeah, you can see it's up on my altar there. Little Works for Wear, along with some other talisman that I've collected over the years that have no significance for me. You can see numerous yogas and the Buddha and Don Quixote on the far right-hand side. Many different talismans there. Some of them I can't really explain or really want to at this point. Although one of them is a piece of prairie that you gave me when I first started here, just so you should know. So in the final strip, which this is it's in winter, Calvin says, "Wow, it really snowed last night. Isn't that wonderful?" Especially in summertime, it's nice to hear that. Hobbes responds, "Everything familiar has disappeared. The world looks brand new." Calvin, "A new year, a fresh, clean start." Hobbes, "It's like having a big white sheet of paper to draw on." Calvin, "A day full of possibilities. It's a magical world, Hobbes, old buddy. Let's go exploring." and then they race down the hill on their sled. I will tell you, it is how I try to live every day of my life. Every day is a day full of possibilities. Not holding on to grudges or regrets of days gone by. Wouldn't it be great if we could all just have a clean slate? We sometimes don't believe we can have a clean slate. We're sort of weighed down by the past events of our lives, for better and for worse. You know, it's not always about the way it used to be, or we tried that before and it didn't work. We so often tend to focus on the memories of our failures much more than we focus on the memories of our times we've succeeded. Sometimes despite overwhelmingly long odds, and sometimes despite our own seeming ignorance of our ability to succeed. But it is not just in letting go of the old ways of doing things, but also the need to have the ability to move forward, to try new things, like in this strip. It's not a return to a prior age of innocence that in all truth probably never existed and is just imagined. This is a going forward with a full knowledge of all that we are and all that we have ever been, with full knowledge of all the suffering that we've experienced and all the suffering in the world. And still, despite that, we move forward, undefeated. We move forward with a full heart. We move forward with a sense of wonder for what is still possible. We move forward with the hope of being better than we currently are. Sometimes we can start in small ways, like starting a new spiritual practice, or maybe finally deciding to go to the gym, even though I've had a gym membership for over a year. Those are small ways we can start. Sometimes we're forced to start in big ways. For me, this has happened a few times in my life. Right? Once when I moved from New York to Florida without a job or a place to live, I had faith that there was a better environment to raise my children in. And I was willing to risk everything to explore that. And I'm sure that's why many people live here in the Quad Cities, honestly, and have found their way to this congregation, right? So that you can be part of a good environment to live your lives. My second major exploration was when I decided to change careers at the height of my career to become a minister. I had faith that there was a different, better way to live my life than the way I was currently living it. And I was willing to risk everything to explore that. And my third major exploration, honestly, was moving to Iowa, where I had never been before. Yes, it was a change in culture, because I had the faith that together we could come together and grow together in our shared ministry to help build a special community, a beloved community. And I was, and still am, willing to risk everything to explore that. It always starts with an attitude, though. An attitude of exploration. An attitude that there is something more, an undiscovered country. Whether it's out there in the stars, or whether it's inside in the depths of our souls. An attitude of a willingness to embrace the unknown, and as Mark Twain said, throw off the bow lines. I quote the whole quote. 20 years from now, he said, you will be more disappointed by the things you didn't do than by the things you did do. So throw off the bowline, sail away from safe harbor, catch the trade winds in your sails, explore. End quote. And we are here to come together, to create a safe environment to explore the big questions of life. Now Calvin, the one in the comics, well, I guess actually both Calvins, has certainly explored the big questions of life. And one of the questions that Calvin explored was the question of the existence of God and humanity's relationship to God. And here you can see a clear progression of his thought. In this first strip, we see a destroyed living room, right? And Calvin asks, "Do you think God lets you plea bargain?" And Hobbes responds, "I worry more about your mother." And in this question about how humanity worries about eternal retribution for our ill-conceived acts, it depicts the human fear of a vengeful God, something our Unitarian and Universalist ancestors rejected. Hobbes, of course, the anchor of human response, wondering whether our concept of a vengeful God translates to a vengeful humanity. Or maybe it was our recognition of our own vengefulness that created our image of a vengeful God. But really, the message here, perhaps, is to reduce our need for vengefulness. Let alone, don't mess up a room like that. But our next strip here, Hobbes is the Tiger of Reason is asking Calvin if he thinks there is a God. And Calvin responds, "Well, someone is out to get me." Again, this endorses the theory that there is an unknown active force at work in the universe. But it is also a statement of humanity not taking responsibility for the challenges that we face in our lives and in the world. And as we experience more of the world and the suffering in the world, we start to question why, of course, would an all-powerful, all-knowing God allow such suffering? Well, Calvin ponders this as well, both in regard to Santa Claus and God. He puts them both on the same level. He says, why all the secrecy? Why all the mystery if the guy exists? I'm noticing the patriarchal language in there, of course. Why doesn't he ever show himself and prove it? If he doesn't exist, what's the meaning of all this, he says. So what is the meaning of all this? That is the big question, of course, that religion seeks to answer. And that is the question we come together to search for week in and week out. What is the meaning and purpose of our lives? And of course, the next logical step that Calvin makes is that we humans are gods in our own right. As Calvin states here, made in God's image, yes sir, of which Hobbes replied, God must have a goofy sense of humor. Which of course brings Calvin to the next logical conclusion of utilizing the power of humanity and in some ways forgetting the humility of humanity. In this strip, Calvin is threatening a plant, and he states, so you want water, huh? Well, I've got a big can of it here. It's up to me to decide if you get water or not. I control your fate. Your very lives are in my hands. Do you feel that way when you're gardening? I just want to know. Without me, you are as good as dead. Without me, you don't. And then you see the rain coming down to water the plants. It is a reminder that we are part of a larger world, that we do not and cannot control everything, that there are powers in the world, in this case nature, that work beyond our knowledge and understanding and control. And when we get just a little too high and mighty, the world has a way of reminding us that we are merely human. We have great power, but as Spider-Man's uncle said, with great power comes great responsibility. Comic strips has a lot of wisdom. I'm just going to point that out. And a need for stewardship. With power comes the need for stewardship of all things and all people. And a reminder that we are connected with the interdependent web of existence. A reminder that perhaps there are things in the universe that we do not physically comprehend. Some people may call that God. Some people may call that the ground of all being. Some people may call that things in the universe we do not comprehend. It's true. All are fine, I think. So let us go forward, I would ask, with some humility, using our humanity to help grow. To grow the plants like we have in our garden out here. Those, to me, are true miracles. They keep growing and growing. To grow justice, as we do on our various social justice teams. But most of all, to grow our lives. And to help others grow their lives, as we do in worship and in our various educational and spiritual programs that we have at the congregation. So Thomas Hobbes is probably best known for his famous phrase, "The life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." Although in some ways his view of humanity is somewhat as dim as similar to Calvin's was, but what is left out of that one statement was his discussion on how we as a society come together to alleviate this. And he calls for the need of society to sacrifice certain freedoms in exchange for safety. Not always a worldview that I prescribe to, but there's a lot of history and the focus on society over the individual. And although his writings were more geared towards social and political needs as opposed to theology, I do see in his writings the same yearnings, the same explorations for how we can live together and find peace in a covenantal community. He described governments as the great Leviathan and that mortal God. He called it that without which that we would revert to chaos. It is a taking of our destiny into our own hands and out of the hands of the gods. That was what he believed in. And Calvin and Hobbes speaks to this question as well in a very, I think, poignant way. Now this strip speaks to the question of how our destinies are in some ways shaped by others. Calvin asks Hobbes, "Do you believe our destinies are controlled by the stars?" And Hobbes responds, "No, I think we can do whatever we want with our lives." To which Calvin responds, "Well, not to hear Mom and Dad tell it." Now, some of us may have been raised in families that supported our dreams and wishes, but I know many of us were raised with limited visions of what our destinies could be. Although my grandfather on a weekly basis would fill up my dreams with statements that I could do whatever I put my mind to, I often found the world gave me other contradictory messages. Messages of what the expectations were for a Jewish boy from the Bronx. But what were the messages I asked you to think about as you were growing up, that you received when you were young? Were they encouraging or were they limiting? If they were limiting, what were you able to do to break through them and break out? Or maybe still, what could you do to break through and break out of those limitations? What is limiting you today, I would ask. And I would ask us to all think about what is limiting us as a congregation today. Often we sort of build up defenses to ward off others. In this script, Calvin walls himself inside a fort with a firepower of 200 snowballs. He says, "Nobody can tell me what to do. I can stay out here all day. At last I am the master of my fate. I'll stay out as long as I please." That's how I imagine him saying it. And the next screen there shows him coming inside with his mother saying, "Back inside so soon?" And he remarks, "Well, it's too cold outside." How often do we do this, right? We get our backs up just to prove that we can do whatever we want, even if sometimes it is not in our best interests. Again, the message is just because we have the power to do something doesn't mean we should do it. But the question also remains is, what do we really have control over? Are we through years of conditioning as a species heading in a certain trajectory that is unavoidable, or can we take matters into our own hands? Now, throughout the comic strip, you'll see Calvin and Hobbes are seen riding on a wagon or a sled, hurtling down a hill. I look at this wagon and sled as sort of a metaphor for our journey through life. You know, in this strip, Calvin asks Hobbes, "Do you believe in fate, Hobbes? You mean that our lives are predestined, Calvin?" "Yeah, that the things we do are inevitable?" And Hobbes goes, "What a scary thought," just as they hurtle off the end of the ramp into the water. So I think the comic strip maybe is confusing causality with fate. But yes, if we ride a wagon off the edge of the bridge, we are going to crash in the water. You know, if we do dangerous things, there is a higher risk of something bad happening to us. But with foreknowledge and awareness of what is at the end of the bridge, we can take action. And the comic actually has a solution for us. As they are hurtling down the hill, Calvin says, you know, sometimes it seems things go by just too quickly. We're so busy watching out for what's just ahead of us that we don't take the time to enjoy where we are. Days go by and we hardly notice them. Life becomes a blur. And as they hurtle off the mountain, he says, often it takes a calamity to make us live in the present moment. And then suddenly we wake up and see all the mistakes that we've made, but it's too late to change anything as they fall over the cliff. So Calvin is busy, of course, quoting the Buddha here, who told us to awake to the present moment. And yes, we should take some time to look ahead and to see what is around the bend, but let us live in the present moment, to change who we are to be, who we want to be, before it's too late. For if the hill is the metaphor for our life, then the end of the hill, the cliff, is our death. So as long as we have life, it is not too late to act. And as one last comic strip brings us back to the beginning, with Calvin stating, we all want meaningful lives. We look for meaning in everything we do, but suppose, he says, there is no meaning, and life is fundamentally absurd. Suppose there's no reason or truth or rightness in anything. What if nothing means anything? What if nothing really matters? And then after they've fallen off the cliff one more time, he finishes by saying, or suppose everything matters, which would be worse, end quote. The truth is we can never know. But suppose, just suppose that everything matters. Every person you meet, every word that you say, every action that you take. Suppose it all matters in regard to whether the world has meaning. Suppose it all matters in regard to whether our lives have meaning. What would you do knowing that it all matters? So I invite you to let life call you on to explore that possibility. Let us find wisdom from all the Unitarian Universalists who have preceded us. Let us slow down that wagon and take time to find the wisdom from all of our joys and our sorrows from our lives. Let us find wisdom in being together, week after week, building relationships and exploring the deep questions of life. Life is full of possibilities, a clean slate. May it be so.